Alright, so at this point, most of you are probably aware of my rather dim view of L. Frank Baum's Wizard of Oz, and for those of you who aren't, you can watch my Books vs. Movies review of Wizard of Oz and find out pretty quickly. However, regardless of my opinions, there's no doubt that this story has captured the hearts, minds, and courage of generation after generation. See what I did there? With hearts, minds, and... I know courage doesn't make a lot of sense, but... shut up. Over a century later, people are still entranced by this story. It shaped our society and our culture. You cannot talk about the history of storytelling without bringing up The Wizard of Oz, either in its book or its movie form. Additionally, this story inspired what all compelling stories seem to inspire: sequels. Nearly 40 of them, in fact, to say nothing of the countless adaptations in all forms of media, visual, textual, and everything in between. Baum had no intention of continuing the story after writing The Wizard of Oz, but such was the response from fans that he felt compelled to write The Marvelous Land of Oz, which follows a new cast of characters and also catches us up on the goings-on of some of the more popular characters from the first book. But even that wasn't enough, and soon Baum had penned a third Oz book, Ozma of Oz, and it was with this book that Baum finally threw up his hands and decided to write a longer Oz series. But it's these two in particular that interest us today. In 1985, Disney decided to make another Oz-based movie, but instead of focusing on The Wizard of Oz, decided to base its story on the first two Oz sequels. This movie was titled Return to Oz. Though the movie was a commercial and critical disappointment, it's inspired something of a cult following, and as far as I'm concerned, it's a fairly decent and underrated attempt by Disney at a time when the studio wasn't doing terribly well in the movie department. But is it anything compared to the classic stories? Well, let's take a look. This is Books vs. Movies review of the Oz sequels. Now, this movie is actually based on two books, kind of smooshed together, and so we have two protagonists to compare. So let's take a look at Dorothy and Ozma. We'll look at Dorothy first, since that's the familiar character. Now, I said in the Wizard of Oz review that I didn't think that I'd encountered a more bland protagonist than Dorothy from the first book. She was basically just a vehicle for the character changes in the companions, and didn't really serve any purpose outside of being the one familiar aspect of a very strange land. Dorothy doesn't make an appearance in the second Oz book at all, but the third Oz book, despite being titled Ozma of Oz, is all about Dorothy. Dorothy is with her Uncle Henry on a boat trip to Australia. She falls overboard during a storm and rides a chicken coop into a neighboring land of Oz called the Land of Ev. Like you do. Where she has various adventures and so on. And I have to say that this Dorothy, unlike the Dorothy from the first book, has a lot more personality. There seems to have been a conscious effort to make her into a more interesting character. She's brave, fiercely loyal to her friends, and really more of a heroine in this story than she was in the other one. That being said, though, she has about as much character development as Dorothy from the first book. Which is to say, none at all. It does become increasingly clear that she wants to return home so she can look after her ailing Uncle Henry, but even that motivation is kind of sporadic. She doesn't really spare him a thought until the end of the story. The Dorothy in the movie is played by Fairuza Balin, and the first thing you'll notice about her is that she's actually a little girl, not a teenager like Judy Garland. And just like the Dorothy from the book, she's brave and loyal to her friends. And also, at the beginning, we get to see the consequences of Dorothy having visited Oz in the first place. That despite the fact that at the end of Wizard of Oz, she said she never wanted to leave her home ever again, she still yearns to return to this magical land and see her friends again. It gets to the point where she can't sleep, and Aunt Em and Uncle Henry are so worried that they decide she needs shock therapy in order to get rid of these delusions. And just like in the original musical, it's never made clear whether or not Oz is a real place or just a dream of Dorothy's. It puts the character a little more firmly into reality. But there's still not a lot of development of character in the movie. Dorothy still wants to be a part of Oz at the end, she's just learned to keep it to herself. And Blaine's acting is a little wooden, not bad or anything, just a little stilted. In the end, it's kind of a toss-up between them, so let's look at our other protagonist, Princess Ozma. In the Land of Oz, the protagonist for much of the story is a boy named Tip, who lives with a sinister wannabe witch named Mombi. He has adventures in Oz with his various companions, and in the end it transpires that the boy Tip is actually a girl named Ozma, who is kidnapped by the wizard as a baby and taken to Mombi to be transformed into a boy so that nobody would suspect that she is the rightful heir to the throne of Oz. Which you have to admit is a little weird. And it raises a number of questions which... You know what, let's not even get into it. Ozma plays a much smaller role in the movie. We first meet her as a mysterious girl in Kansas who apparently only Dorothy can see, and who eventually helps Dorothy escape from the hospital. By the end, it transpires that she too was kept as a prisoner of Mombi, but she was trapped in a mirror and apparently only Dorothy could save her. As a result, we don't see a whole lot of her. And to be honest, her backstory is kind of phoned in. I mean, there's this whole other interesting storyline about this girl who should have been the ruler of Oz, and we only get it in like the last 10 minutes of the film. It seems like they were almost banking on the fact that most people watching the movie would already know who Ozma was. But I feel like the movie might have done better to focus a little more on her character and her journey. They could have still left out the whole transgender bit, but Ozma is still a vastly more interesting character than Dorothy is. The movie tried to form this relationship between them where it was like Dorothy was Ozma's parallel in Kansas, but even that was kind of phoned in, interesting though it was. Dorothy's character may be a toss-up, but Ozma's character is definitely more interesting in the books just because she's actually in the books. But what about the bad guys who fought against Dorothy, her companions, and the Land of Oz itself? In Wizard of Oz, the book at least, the main villain was more of a joke than a threat. The villains of Land of Oz follow that same trend. We have Mombi, who aside from threatening to kill Tip at the beginning of the story, doesn't really do much of a sinister nature and is generally ineffectual, much like the Wicked Witch of the West. There's also General Ginger and her all-girl army, who march on the Emerald City and wrest control away from the Scarecrow, saying that it's high time that girls ruled Oz. But these villains are mostly just stupid and silly, using knitting needles as weapons and winning the day largely because of the stupidity of their opponents rather than their own competence. Overall, they're about as threatening as Twilight fans. The villains of Ozma of Oz, however, were considerably more threatening. There's the Princess Langwidere, who has 30 different heads that she wears as the mood strikes her. Like you do. There are the Wheelers, an alarming but ultimately harmless race of mischief makers who enjoy chasing people around and threatening them. And then there's the Gnome King, who is by far the best villain of the first 3 books simply because he's actually a villain. He's not a joke, he is actually a threat, and part of that is because he doesn't act like a villain. He gives off this persona of being very kind and wanting so badly to help Dorothy and her companions, and even acts as though he's giving them every chance. But in the end, he never had any intention of being either reasonable or helpful. There are moments when you actually think he might be an okay guy in both the book and the movie, but ultimately, he's a villain, through and through. Now, the movie only had 2 villains, but it basically combined the stronger villains from the 3rd book with the stronger aspects of the villain from the 2nd book. We have Mombi's name, her powder of life, and her holding of Ozma, but we combine that with the 30 heads of Princess Langwidere, who admittedly is more vain and spoiled in the book than she is evil. The movie also asks a question that the book doesn't, which is, where did she get those 30 heads? And the movie answers the question, oh, she got them from actual people. How lovely. They also threw in the Wheelers as her slaves for good measure, making them that much creepier because they, have actual power. Similarly, the Gnome King story is combined with General Ginger's conquest of Oz, and when I say conquest, I mean an actual conquest. The Yellow Brick Road, Munchkin Land, and Emerald City aren't just conquered, but all out destroyed. And all the people of the Emerald City are turned to stone. Why? Because the wizard, in addition to driving out the royal family so he could take power for himself, also stole the emeralds from the Gnome King so he could build the Emerald City. Or so the Gnome King claims. Whether or not this is true is never made entirely clear, but given the wizard's track record, it's certainly plausible. At any rate, the movie created a very sinister atmosphere. The movie was dark and there was actual conflict, and while there was a fair amount of conflict in the 3rd Oz book, the conflict in the 2nd Oz book was negligible. And the movie gave us some truly evil bad guys to fight.